3, 2, and 1.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's event with Ann Caws and Grace Schulman. Tonight, we'll have the pleasure of hearing our two speakers discuss Caws's new biography of Mina Loy, titled Apology of Genius. Tracing Loy's life is no easy feat. She morphs with each stage of her development as an artist, making it difficult to pin Loy down to any single label. She was a poet, painter, novelist, essayist, manifesto writer, actress, and dress and lampshade designer. The tremendous variety of her work reflects the tremendous variety of the events that punctuated her life. Loy took on an active role in the emerging Italian Futurist movement in Florence, savored the friendships of Gertrude Stein and André Gide in Paris, and eventually lived on the Bowery with the Bowery Bums, wearing her nightgown in order to join them. She adopted a pliable stance towards her identity, and this is only part of what makes her such a compelling character. Ann Caws draws together 9 cohesive, pointed chapters that a figure that is Mina Loy. By focusing on Loy's poetry as a jumping off point, Caws constructs a unique angle for the biography and provides a singular contribution to today's scholarship on Mina Loy. Ann Caws is a distinguished professor emerita of comparative literature, English, and French at the Graduate School of the City University of New York. Her many areas of interests are 20th century avant-garde literature and art, which include surrealism, poets René Char and André Breton, Virginia Woolf and the Bloomsbury Group, and artists Robert Motherwell, Joseph Cornell, and Pablo Picasso. Conceptually, one of her primary themes has been the relationship between image and text. Also, we're very pleased to have Grace Schulman, whose latest book of poems is The Marble Bed, and her recent memoir is Strange Paradise, Portrait of a Marriage. She is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Letters and has been awarded the Frost Medal for Distinguished Lifetime Achievement in American Poetry, given by the Poetry Society of America. She is the editor of the Poems of Marianne Moore and is a distinguished professor of English at Baruch College, CUNY. She also has a new book coming out, which is titled Again, The Dawn, New and Selected Poems, which is forthcoming in November from Turtle Point Press. So thank you so much, Grace and Ann, for being here. And now I will turn it over to Ann Caws.
Thank you. So this is very exciting to be speaking with Grace. They said, with whom do I want to speak? And I said, well, Grace Schulman, my friend, the poet. And there are a lot of reasons. And In the Marble Bed is a poem that I want to refer to called Eve Speaks, which is about naming and naming things. And so since Mina Loy was so passionate about words and naming and doing puns all the time her whole life, I thought that that would be an interesting thing to mention. Now, the people I want to thank are, of course, Roger Conover, very first, because he is the person who knows more than anybody in the world about Mina Loy and Arthur Craven, and has helped enormously. He was my editor at MIT and has helped enormously with this book. And then Carolyn Burke, whose biography, of course, of Mina Loy is the big thing I relied on. I mean, how would I know except for Carolyn, who also told me about drinking cappuccinos. The best way to do it is dry cappuccino. And then Gallery 1900, 2000, who helped a great deal with peculiar images, which may or may not be Arthur Craven's. And then Michael Lehman, who is my editor at Reaction and who published this book, which I think is very beautiful. And then Paula Cooper and the 192 books I have loved, every single thing I've ever done here. And Francis Neumann, whose enormous picture of the whole Arensberg Salon is really important and stretched out over 2 pages. And then Margot and Anthony Boscusi, who invited me to speak to poets in New York about Zaha and Mina Loy, and that's how I got my whole initiation. However, the reason I did this book, and Grace said why, and I can tell you why, it's because I thought Roger Conover had appointed me to do it, and it's wonderful that it gets done in any case, so I'm totally delighted. Okay, so it's all Grace's beginning.
Well, Marianne, you've written a very important book about a major poet who has not been accorded the recognition of her major contemporaries. That is, she was born in the same 1880s decade as Pound, Moore, Williams, H.D. What drew you to write about her? You've mentioned a few things, but something must have drawn you into the work itself. Also, you've written some wonderful books about visual artists. Now, she was a painter as well as a poet, but you're writing about her poetry, and I wonder what really drew you into the work itself.
I'm so glad you asked me. So, Evan, can we see the pictures? Because obviously it's important to look at her paintings, which we will, but maybe we could go to the top and see a picture of her. Okay, this is awful. Let me just start right here with this. I dislike enormously this kind of artificial painting that she did, and l'amour d'orloté. She spoke every known language. Mina Loy spoke lots of languages, which is nice. But this particular one just drives me wild. And I thought, why don't I take a poet painter, which is what she was, why don't I take what I dislike the most and launch into that? So I talk about what I love and what I dislike. And if we could go to, can we go, oh, we'll look at her here. So if you look at, thank you, that's towards the end of her life. That's not when she's young and very beautiful, but she was always beautiful. And that was a problem. And of course, the problem was that, of course, everybody fell in love with her, the men, women, and everybody else. And me too. But the person I really loved was the person she really loved. Can we see Arthur Craven? It's going to be, Arthur Craven is going to be, he's bullfighting. I mean, he's fighting. No, maybe at the top, sorry. Well, maybe we don't have him. Goodness. Okay, he was a fighter, and I didn't love that picture of him. But the reason I wanted to write about Mina Loy and her love for Arthur Craven was we don't know one damn thing about how he died. So her whole life, Mina Loy, once she met him, she never wanted to know anything else. We don't know what happened to him. She doesn't know. And the rest of her life, she was haunted by not knowing how he died. I mean, there's a whole story about it. Nobody thinks that he died the way he is said to have died. You know, it's kind of like Hart Crane. You go off of a boat and nobody knows. So that he went off a boat. That's the end of it. Was not the end of Mina Loy, I'm happy to say. However, I think it's really important to begin that way. And then, Grace, you get to ask something because I'm so excited about this. I'm excited about having done this book. It took years to get the permissions for everything, years.
You said her beauty is a problem. How can beauty ever be a problem? In what way was her beauty a problem?
Evan, can I see other pictures? Or is there a picture of her? Well, beauty. Because people didn't want to see past it to her poetry. And I think that whole issue that a lot of feminists have with this particular issue is that she didn't want to be noted for her beauty, although she and her two children were incredibly beautiful. And everybody would stop dead on the street like that. And I think that that is part of the problem about the poetry. She said my poetry is worth nothing. I mean, I don't think that she's right, but, you know, I'm allowed to say, I think your poetry is pretty great, dear Mina, whom I did not know, of course. And since we're there, can we look at, that image right below that, Evan? So this is what I wanted to tell you about. This is, of course, Mina Loy looking wonderful. I think she always does. I'm not prejudiced or anything. And there's Jane Heap and, you know, various trans people behind her, you know, all that. And there's Tristan Tzara and Brancusi, you know. And so she wrote wonderful poetry about Brancusi, Brancusi, and his absolute one of her best poems is about one of Brancusi's things. But I want you to see Tzara because I will bring that up towards the end. And Why don't we, in fact, why don't even let's show that one right now. The one you're on. Yeah, that is dreadful, of course. Christ on a coastline. And the whole issue about religion comes up all the time. She had a very Jewish father who was very proud of himself as a Jew, and a really terrible mother who was prudish in every way. They didn't get along, but they had to get married, one of those things. And the Christ on a clothesline is a fisherman, she knew. And it seems to me so interesting that this keeps coming up. The religious imagery comes up, soaring through. And what I'm not going to talk about, and anybody wants to buy this book, you will see I do not talk about Anglo-Mongols and the Rose, that famous poem of hers that everybody speaks at length about. Mina Loy is very much in favor now. Everybody speaks about it. I have nothing to say about it. I find it totally loathsome from beginning to end. And I only talk about the poems of hers I really like and appreciate. Okay, up to you, Grace, whatever now.
I won't mention the poem you love, but I just feel that the subject of it is less about her parents than about social mores, which she's satirizing and criticizing, which is an important part of her persona, herself. If not a poem you like, it speaks to what she's about. She's a great satirist in so many ways. But I did want to ask about the poems. Early on, Pound discovered her as at the same time as discovering Marianne Moore and H.D. Now, the other two went on to brilliant careers, and yet she did not. One theory might be the Imagist movement. She was not an Imagist. Pound heralded the Imagist movement in 1912. She could never be an Imagist. Williams wrote, no ideas, but in things, she would say no things matter except for the ideas. She wrote, she was not shy of abstractions. The Imagists, Pound wrote, go in fear of abstractions. She was not afraid of abstractions. She wrote them often. Pound characterized her poetry as logopoeia, or poetry that is akin to nothing but language, which is a dance of the intelligence among words and ideas and modification of ideas of characters. This is a long way of asking you, does that, do you think, have to do with her unfair, lesser recognition than her major contemporaries?
I think that's fascinating. And of course, now there isn't anybody I know who is not writing about Mina Loy and showing her objects. I mean, she's very much, perhaps too much. Everybody says to me, oh, not another book about Mina Loy. Well, yes. Right there, Evan, can you go up to the picture of Marianne Moore? Because Grace is the world specialist on Marianne Moore. And this, of course, is Mina Loy's portrait of Marianne Moore. But I think that the play on words, which Grace brought up, is so important. That's, of course, what Pound recognized in her. And if you read, and I love reading her, she's a great writer. I mean, no issue about it. Mina Loy was a great writer in prose as well as poetry. And I don't love her plays, but everything she wrote was amazingly interesting. All those manifestos and all those stories and all of it absolutely fascinating. And it's about wordplay very often. For example, the salon des refusés, the refuse, and garbage, the refuse. Well, of course, it's in French, but she did a lot of writing in French, of course. But the way that she would take one word, like the salon des refusés, the refused, and refuse, and then her own refugees, her art objects were her refugees. And she spent her life treasuring those objects. And that's what Roger Conover is going to be showing in his next show of Mina Loy. So I think, Grace, that the play on words is really the point of Pound's love of her. And of course, my love of her, I'm a translator, I think, above all. And so that's the way I'm interested in her. And how in the world do you translate an image, you know, that you're seeing? And you asked me about her selves, and I'm so interested in the way her self, she had all these selves. She was like Pessoa. She had thousands of selves. And so some of them were futurists and some of them were, you know, salon people and some of them. So I think that that question that you raised with me about her selves is really interesting. You can see in every one of her poems what self she's being. When she's doing the Café du Néant, and so she's doing her futurist self. And, you know, it's so interesting to me. And, you know, you're such a great poet. So Mina Loy was not maybe a great poet, but she was certainly right up there in my heroine's thing, because she was a poet and a painter and an everything and a liver. And I think at some point, maybe not yet, but maybe I want to talk about her Christian Science, because it was so important to her, having spoken about the Anglo-Mongols and the Rose, and you're absolutely right, it's about social everything, that she gave up the world, in a sense, to be a meditator. And when I was writing on her, I had to go by the Christian Science Church and go in it. And, you know, because I write on Joseph Cornell, I had to do a whole thing about Christian Science. I had to write to the Christian Science Church and get permission to publish Cornell's letters to his mother, who was, of course, in the sky, though, of course, nobody ever does, but she was in the sky, as was his brother. So I had to get permission to do that. And the whole issue for me of writing on a Christian Scientist was really extraordinary. I hadn't thought that that would be, when I was commissioned to do this, and I was commissioned, of course, by my publisher, Reaction, I hadn't realized that I would be sinking deeper and deeper into things I wasn't really excited about sinking into. In my hometown, Wilmington, North Carolina, there's a plaque about the person who founded Christian Science, Mary Baker Eddy, right there in my hometown. And you're thinking, and I think we're all thinking, and Grace certainly as a poet brings up, I love her poetry, it brings up the past and the present altogether. And for me, writing on Mina Loy brought up things I did not think I'd be talking about, lampshades. Nor would I, my mother was an actress, nor did I think I'd be talking about, can we show that one, Evan? It's the one when she's acting with William Carlos Williams. Yeah, so that's William Carlos Williams, who of course fell in love with her. I mean, who didn't? But he did, of course, like everybody else. And there she was, acting as well as doing lampshades, and, you know, writing plays. I mean, what did she not do? And it is very much, in my view, to go back to selves, like Pessoa and all those different selves, that you read him and you know that he's all these different selves. And she was a futurist, and then she was a surrealist, and then she was this and that, and with Duchamp, and she was, then she was a Gertrude Steinist, and, you know, pictures of Gertrude Stein here. A lot of things she was like, and maybe not always like herself, which was that kind of part of the reason that she's not, has not until now been known as well as H.D. and Marianne Moore and the other, and Emily Dickinson, is because she was so various. I mean, I have not ever seen anybody as various as Mina Loy. And I think that's the reason I accepted the commission and took all these many, many years to write about it. Over to you, Grace.
Marianne, you mentioned, let's tease out a few of these very rich strands. You mentioned Futurism. Now, was she more attracted to the futurists, such as Marinetti, or to the style of Futurism, the idea of Futurism, or did both attract her simultaneously?
Well, when you read her Futurist Manifesto, you can see that was really the ideas. When you read the poems written about Papini, whom she loved, I mean, the rivalry between Papini and Marinetti and Futurism is incredible. It goes on and on. And between Florence and Milan, and the whole issue of Futurism comes up all the time. And every time Mina Loy was able to write a poem that captures exactly the fights they had, the rivalry they had, Papini against Marinetti. Marinetti shouted all the time, as you know, and besides, he wrote in this wonderful language, and he was attractive to her in every way. Papini was kind of the other side of it. And I love the fact that she was involved with both of them. And they disliked each other naturally, Milan and Florence, and the dislike of the futurists for each other is well known. And Mina Loy's writing on these futurist manifestos and many of her stories, and if you read her stories, that Sarah Krangle and a lot of people have written about and brought and edited, amazing. You can see the difference in the poem influenced by Marinetti or influenced by Papini. And the ideas, you write the ideas of futurism, but it was also the performance. And if there was ever a performer, it was Mina Loy. She was performing in all those costumes, performing in all these backdrops. And I think that performance issue, as well as what you're looking at now, as well as acting, is truly important. She performs in her poems. And therefore, when she gets to be, I shouldn't put in a therefore, but let me re-put in the therefore. When she gets to be a little elderly, and I'm not showing you pictures of that because she so much hated getting elderly looking and having white hair, which I, of course, have white hair, but I'm not, alas, Mina Loy. But Mina Loy really disliked being older. And many of her poems at the end of her life, or even in the middle of her life, are haunted by death. She was death haunted amazingly her whole life. And there's no way of not dealing with that. I tried to deal with it in the poetry, and I end the book with a poem that is not dated for a very good reason. I wanted it to be there. And, you know, when she was involved with Christian Science, and she was reading Gerard Manley Hopkins, Yonder, Yonder, Yonder. Many of her poems are influenced by her reading, and I love that. So all these different ways of Mina Loy performing Mina Loy seemed to me so interesting. I couldn't put down the book, and I obviously didn't put it down until very recently.
Marianne, are you there?
I'm right here.
Okay.
Yeah.
Another strand that you mentioned. Why was she so attracted to Arthur Craven?
Oh,
They went penniless in Mexico. He was a boxer. He was a flamboyant character. Why in the world? How? Can you explain her relationship, her attraction to him?
well, I have the same attraction. If I were doing anything, he wrote only in French, Craven. So the best translator of him exists, and therefore it's not going to be me. But Arthur Craven and his whole peculiar, very violent, very extraordinarily not like anyone else life, as well as being this boxer and the rest of it, was gorgeous when he was young. He was very elegant. And Mina Loy herself, very elegant. That is the most elegant couple who ever graced New York and the New York everything. And then my personal, I'll just tell you one personal thing, which I'm allowed to do. We have time, one personal thing. So I was in, where was I, in Naples or something? I was in Rome, and I went into a bookstore. And what did I see but Arthur Craven, who wrote this book called Maintenant, Now. He didn't write in English, he wrote in French. And that's the only language I can deal with besides English at all. I read this book and I was totally captivated and thought, okay, if anybody will let me write on Arthur Craven, I will do it. Well, Arthur Craven, of course, was Oscar Wilde's nephew, and, you know, everything about him is fascinating. And then he dies in this fascinating, nobody knows how kind of way. And yes, they were penniless. She adored him. I don't think you can explain love, but you can certainly see that Mina Loy, her whole life, once she met him, that was it. I mean, that was it for her love, period, stop. And when he died, she would say, maybe he's not dead, but, you know, try to trace him. Maybe not. Marcel Duchamp loved him. Who didn't love Arthur Craven? I would have loved him immediately. And I would have given up my life for him the way she did. But luckily, I didn't have to.
uh, I don't think he's that constructive partner uh, for a writing woman, an independent woman. But she had other loves too. You write about her other marriages, her children.
Oh my.
Her life was quite filled with loves, one after another. Would you say Craven was the most loved in her?
Yes. And the last. Yes.
Well,
And Haywas with whom she was at the beginning and all that kind of thing. The most sad thing to me about her marriages and loves is that she lost the child she most loved called Ova, and she was a year old and she died. And so Mina Loy, whom you cannot help but respect and admire, I mean, anybody doesn't, I'll go out and strangle them with my two fists. She made a statue of this child she lost, and this wooden statue, and she loved that child and stayed up all night. But she never complained in her poetry, except when her husband, whom I loathe, Stephen Haywas, loathe him, would have hated him. He went up the stairs to see his mistress when she was having a baby. And that poem called Futurism, giving birth, is probably the most terrifying poem you can read. And these days, you know, given what is happening with Roe and Wade and all that, everything, Mina Loy is so present now. I mean, I can't imagine anybody more present than her right now. Over to you, Grace.
well, back to her poetry. Eliot expressed admiration, T.S. Eliot expressed admiration for Mina Loy's poetry when she retained the support of the image, even if only as the point of departure, he wrote, as in a poem called The Effectual Marriage. But in the highly abstract human cylinders, the word separates from the thing. I'm quoting T.S. Eliot now, and he found the poem not as good. Do you agree with that? I'm not sure what she does with abstractions, of course, is really quite original and fine. She'll put an odd word expressing an idea or a new concept at the end of a line for the line break to pique your curiosity as to what comes next. Now, do you agree with that?
Absolutely. I'm so glad you brought it up, because when you read these two edited volumes by Roger Conover of Mina Loy, extraordinary, 26 years apart. And when he sent me the first one, he said, "You're the person who inhabits her universe, her moon and her universe. And you've got to write this book." That was 29 years ago. It took me 29 years to realize I had to write the book. But if you look in the Beinecke, which is where all her things are, you see one word here and one word, you know, way down the page. So visual was her poetry that the way she separated abstractly, if you like, in a pattern much more abstract than most of her painting, though some is, it seems to me so interestingly visually poetic that when we're doing our courses on visual poetics and when we're writing on visual poetics, there's no way not to get Mina Loy in there. Just extraordinary. So thank you, Grace, for bringing that up. That's the abstraction. She takes a word, separates it. That's the abstract painting she does of her poems in those poems. Very different poems at different times of her life, but that one.
So that you do see a connection between her poems and her paintings in that regard, certainly.
Do I? Wow.
You do.
I do.
It's interesting. It's sometimes it's hard to see that.
Well, let's see. Let's look at, Evan, can we look, if you go down a little bit? Yeah, we're going to end with Cornell. Maybe we should get to talking about those poems. Okay, Grace and I are going to talk about the same poems.
On this point, before we leave it, one of my, I should say my favorite of her poems is Brancusi's Golden Bird, which is an ekphrastic.
Oh, I love it. I'm
And
glad we said about Brancusi because you saw him there, right there.
okay, that's Brancusi. But
Brancusi,
Golden Bird
Brancusi,
is
yes.
that marvelous metallic feathers up in the air.
Can we go back to that one, Evan? To the one, yeah. So that's Brancusi. I wrote a book on Brancusi. I had to call him Brancusi because he was Romanian. The ambassador from Romania came to hear me speak. That was a terrible moment. But anyway, so that's Brancusi and that's Sahar, as I said, and that's Mina Loy. How wonderful. So Brancusi, her poem on that is wonderful. You want to read that? Somebody should maybe read that.
Your book, and it's beautiful.
Read some of it. I love it.
As if the toy become the aesthetic archetype, as if some patient peasant god had rubbed and rubbed the alpha and omega of form into a lump of metal. I'm going to interrupt here. You see how she mingles the abstraction with the image, some patient
Absolutely.
god with the alpha and omega of form.
And that's the poem in the painting. She was so akin to the painting of painting that I think her poems do their painting within themselves, about which she writes a great deal and well.
Then this goes on, a naked orientation, unwinged, unplumed, the ultimate rhythm has locked the extremities of crest and claw from the nucleus of flight. You have to imagine this sculpture. The absolute act of art conformed to continent sculpture, bare as the brow of Osiris. This breast of revelation, an incandescent curve, licked by chromatic flames in labyrinths of reflections. So this goes on, but you see the way she mingles abstractions with the concrete and tends to introduce an abstraction at the end of a line. The odd word is dropped at the end of her lines. And she's technically quite morbid. The absolute of art conformed this gong of polished hyperesthesia, end of the line. Hyperesthesia shrills with brass as the aggressive light strikes its significance. The immaculate conception of the inaudible bird occurs
In gorgeous reticence. That's my favorite poem of hers among my other favorite. That's the one. You're so right to link that to the picture, because that is exactly what she's brilliant at, that kind of glistening detail. I mean, that's the way she glistens to people, and she glistened to me. And that poem, I'm so glad you brought it up, glistens to me. I write a lot about that poem because I care about that poem. And I love that anyone listening, that Grace's poem, which is in this book in entirety, Auden and the Metro, I wish you would read that, Grace, because then we will get from that to the communal cut, which I want to talk about.
Thank you for asking, and thank you for quoting it in your book. Could I just say a word about why I think I see the link to Mina Loy? Auden wrote that a poem must praise. Whatever else it does, it must praise for its being and happening. So that praise is ever present in my poems, as well as in hers. But the thing is, you want to introduce an awkward detail or an ugly detail, or tell it as it is, to avoid bathos, to avoid sentimentality. And that's what I hope to be doing here, and what she does all the time in Bowery Bums, for example.
And
Well,
before you read your poem, that I want to say just what you said, absolutely, to avoid bathos. She writes a great deal in many of her, she did a lot of writing against sentimentality. And
Yeah.
her stories are violently against sentimentality. I mean, I've written about that to some extent, but I think that I can't say more strongly how Grace is right about that. There's no bathos in any of Mina Loy. She can make fun of herself and other people, but there's no squishy. She's not squishy.
That's right. Well, here's my poem, Notes from Underground. W.H. Auden on the number 6 train. Hunched in a corner seat, I'd watch him pass writers who gaped at headlines, 300 dead, and in their prized indifference to all others, were unaware he was one who heard meter in that clamor of wheels on rails. Some days I took the local because he did. He sank
I
down,
love it.
he sank down into plastic, his bruised sandals no longer straining with the weight of him. There, with the frankness of the unacquainted, I studied his face, a sycamore's bark with lichen poking out of crevices. His eyes lifted over my tattered copy of his selected poems, then up to where they drilled new windows in the car and found, I guessed, tea roses and a healing fountain. All memories are echoes. Some whisper, others roar, as this does. Dazed by war, I, who winced at thunder, knew that train screeched disaster, how it jolted and veered, station after station, chanting Kyrie eleison, while metal clanged on metal and bulbs went dim. Peering at tracks I heard still persuade us to rejoice. I glimpsed a worn sandal, turned, and then my eyes met his eyes that raid my underworld.
What a poem. And that raid just got to me every time. I wept over that poem and over many of Grace's poems, but I think the raid is that kind of word, is the kind of word that Mina Loy would have gone wild about the sun and the light. And that's what she is brilliant at writing about, I think. And I'm so excited that because of that Grace just read, we get to talk a little about, I think, probably her greatest poem. I mean, there's not a lot of doubt about that. And it's about the Bowery Bums. And indeed, she did sometimes wear her nightgown out to be with them. She wanted to be one of them. They adored her, and how not? And she would give them a little coin or something, and they drank together. And so in this poem, you can feel them drinking together. And I'll read you, don't worry, it's very, very long. I won't read you all of it, but I think that to hear some of it is important. And first I want to read the part that goes, it's just so moving. I couldn't show you the picture that goes with it. I'm so sorry. It's called Communal Cot. And you see a picture of all the bums lying down as if an altarpiece. And this was her altarpiece. She remained religious in the sense of Christian Science. And she is the most moving person I can imagine reading aloud. I won't try. But one part of this Bowery Bums poem, it's called Hot Cross Bums because she was talking about religion. And hot cross buns, of course, is what I'm an Episcopalian. We have, there's a cross on the bun that you eat. And hot cross bums to her is this wordplay. It's so important always. And the church comes and distributes these buns. And that's what the bums are. And the bums, are, of course, are bums. And that's your fesse, or however you say it in English politely, the derrière, the bums are the bums. And I just want to read you part of it and then another part of it. Beyond a held vermilion curtain of neon lows the Bowery. And she moved a lot of times. she moved to be near the Bowery. A lurid lane, leading misfortunes, monsters, the human race altered to arrhythmic stagger along the alcoholic's exit to ecstasia. And in many of Loy's poems, like in all great poets, there's a great contrast, a great sort of convergence of contrast, if you like, between the alcoholic and the ecstasy. So she would give them money so they could drink. And that's a whole another issue. But the issue is that this poem goes on, and I just have to read you what I found so moving to it. Because it then goes, and I'll read you part of the church thing. Oh, some passing church or social worker confides to a brother how he's managed to commandeer a certain provision of hot cross buns. And then what you hear, and I'm bringing up this while we're looking at Saha, that one, whose poems I translated, The Approximate Man. I spent a long time retranslating it. Listen to this. This is Mina Loy. A dull dong bell thuds out admonishment to worship, whose cadence of illenience, she makes up a lot of words, transforms the cross bewailed, the cross is still this cross, to flammable timber of overheating Hades. And when you think of Notre Dame and what's happening with the burning up there, you know, Mina Loy is so present, not just to me, but to all of us who love her. She is so very present. I will go on with this. Waylaying for branding, indirigible bums with a hot cross of overlay buns. And then I wanted to read the Saha that goes along with this, because it's very, this is from 1923 to 1926. And I want to read you, not just because I translated it, but I thought I'd never get over translating it. And she was clearly very close to this when you hear the ding dong bell. Harmony, this is Saha, Approximate Man, most amazing poem. This is the poem when you ever ask André Breton, you know, surrealism, who are the great poets? He would say, well, of course, Tristan Saha. Harmony, let this word be banished from the feverish world I visit. Savage affinities undermined by emptiness, covered with murders, crying out for the impenetrable impasse, sobbing with tattered flamingos. For the fire of anger varies the flickering of the subtle remains, according to the mumbling modulations of hell that your heart strains to hear among the giddy salvos of stars. And stony, I find this weepable over, stony in my garments of schist, you hear T.S. Eliot, of course. Stony in my garments of schist, I've pledged my waiting to the oxidized desert of torment, to the unshakable advent of its flame. So to me, Mina Loy brought out the best in other people, always, always. Everything she wore, everything she did, and certainly the best in me. So do you want to go to chat? Grace, can you add anything?
Just one question. You read a wonderful poem of hers set in the Bowery. How can we explain, how can we make sense out of the contrast between her attraction to the Futurists, some of whom were followers of Mussolini's fascism, and her great, deep sympathy for the poor, the downtrodden, the people on the Bowery, her, if you will, her liberal, we would say today, sympathies. How can we get those two things together? Or was that part of her contradictory selves?
Thank you for saying that. Those are the selves that you find in all those poems. I mean, if we looked at the poems together, I would tell you what's happening when. It's not about what's happening when, it's what's happening inside her. And her inside and her outside and her great clothing thing. And, you know, there she was in Aspen, Colorado, where you can barely walk down the streets. She wore a long skirt and sandals. I mean, she was tripping all the time. She was so aware of how the exterior and the interior went together that I think that's why she could be both attracted to the futurists, which of course she didn't like, she left them, and be so sympathetic with the downtrodden. And many of her poems about the subway, like the one you read, she wrote a great deal about buses and the impoverished. To me, it's just part of her beautiful personality. She left the futurists very early.
She was a study in contrast then, in opposites.
Yes, perfect.
And somehow she got them together. Beautiful.
Did I show you? Oh, Evan, can we see the Man Ray? I forgot to show you this. I wanted to talk about Joseph Cornell. She had a long, no, the one, sorry, no, down. Oh, the blind man's ball is interesting. That's a whole nother issue. That's Marcel Duchamp, everybody. If you could go down one more. There, okay. If we can all see that. So what that is, of course, Man Ray loved her too, but who didn't? This is Joseph Cornell. I was talking about Christian Science and his writing to her. He wrote to her all the time, and he wrote about the Bowery Bums, and he wrote about her beauty and about Christian Science. They were very close. They were the closest she ever was to a man after Arthur Craven. So this is Joseph Cornell, on whom I love to write. And it's one of his boxes with blue paint in there and Man Ray's picture, as you see, of Mina Loy. So it's like Cornell knew how to celebrate. So as Grace was saying about praise, that's absolutely right. Mina Loy knew how to praise, and Joseph Cornell knew. And I love the fact that even in Aspen, when she was white-haired and stumbling and having a hard time getting over the cobblestones, she was herself. She was always all those selves, which were always herself. So we probably could have Q&A. We have time for that, I think. If anybody has any remarks or questions, maybe none. I see in the chat.
Okay.
Okay, there may be no, I just think we spoke so perfectly, there are probably no questions, Grace.
No questions at all?
You could read Eve Speaks if you had it. I have it right in front of me.
Well, let's wait for questions, maybe.
Okay.
Shy. Maybe they're shy.
Well, I only invited 8 people, but I don't know if they feel question-like.
Maybe they're waiting to formulate questions.
I never ask questions, by the way. Today was so amazing with Marina Warner and Francis Wilson. I mean, I don't have any questions because it was so exciting to listen to. So maybe we were so exciting, Grace, that nobody has any questions.
Why don't you read another of her poems?
I was going to read your poem. How about my reading your poem? Eve Speaks.
Well, if you really want me to.
I would love you to. And I can read, I have found another of her poems.
Eve Speaks. This is from The Marble Bed. And it will be in my new and selected Again the Dawn. Eve Speaks. After you had named Leviathan, Ziz for great bird, and called out dissension for when the moon glowered at the sun, creation for beginning, and expulsion for the end. After you gave us willow, thought up on oryx, and what you tagged tornado sent the Olive Guard's tree trembling. And after symbols, almonds for first love, crocus for lamp glow, you fell silent. Because when you had found labels for sin, archangels, heaven, even God help us, God, and each new phrase drowned in lion's roar, or was it divine rage? You declared enough, knowing you'd gone too far. Words can't give life or raise the moon. And still I plead, say my name, Eve, say love, say
I love that. And since I will now quote my favorite poet, Gerard Manley Hopkins, since I have time to read something, I will. This is one of his poems that ends, we follow, now we follow yonder. Yes, yonder, yonder. And I used to go to Ireland to sit in his room. Gerard Manley Hopkins. Let me just read you one thing that's so like Mina Loy. Let joy sighs at God knows when to God knows what, who smiles not wrung, and that's the way she does too. You know, you end smile, and then the S is on the next line. Not wrung, see you unforeseen times rather, as skies between pie mountains, lights a lovely mile. So the mile and the smile. So let me read you a poem of Mina Loy's that I wasn't going to read because I find it so present. So I'll read it. It's called Time Bomb. That's the way I feel in America right now, time bomb. This is Mina Loy, 1945. She's not crazy. She never actually went crazy, but she had a lot of problems with her brain, as I do with mine. But listen to this. Time bomb. The present moment is an explosion, a scission of past and future. And by the way, let me just tell you, since we're not looking at it together, that the punctuation comes way at the other end. This is one of those abstract poems in which it goes, the present moment is an explosion, and then the comma comes way at the end, 2 lines later. So this is a poem, which is a painting. Leaving those valorous disreputables, those ruins, sentinels in an unknown dawn strewn with prophecy. Only the momentary goggle of death fixes the fugitive momentum. She was death haunted, as, of course, since she loved Arthur Craven and didn't know how he died. You couldn't mention him to her, by the way. It was one of those interior anguishes that she had many of. You know, when her child died, she had to go out and celebrate this and that. She would never let on how unhappy she was, never. And I wanted to read you a poem about her being unhappy about her looks. It's called A Woman. She was slim. She became not slim. I've certainly become not slim, but I'm not Mina Loy. She was very beautiful, and then she became a woman. This is called A Woman. Does your mirror bedevil you? Or is the impossible possible to senility, enabling the erstwhile agile, narrow silhouette of self to hold in huge reserve this excessive incognito of a bulbous stranger, only to be exorcised by death? And that kind of writing is the kind of writing she certainly did a lot of. And I find it so amazing. And I think I should read you. You know, Thomas Burton loved her. Every religious person has loved Mina Loy. Paul Blackburn, Robert Creeley, all of them, Aspen. So this is Thomas Merton about her. We are the sacerdotal clowns who feed upon wind and stars and pulverous pastures of poverty. In the raw cavers of the increate, we forge the dusk of chaos to that imperious jewelry of the universe, the beautiful, while to your eyes, a delicate crop of criminal mystic immortel stands to the senses scythe. And he ends the word, I just love this. It was a lot of poem, and it ends, so may you be blessed and be at peace. And then, of course, you know that Thomas Merton died because the air conditioning of the fan killed him. So, you know, there's incredible things.
Marianne, can I interrupt you for a moment?
You know, that's fine to end on that.
We've got some questions here.
Oh, goody. Okay.
Can you get into the chat?
Mm-hmm.
Anna asked,
what was the lampshades? Right. Well, she had to make money. Like, who didn't have to make money, but she had to make money. So she made a lot of lampshades, which there are a lot of pictures of in my book. And some of them I love, very great. Some are about war. Some about, my favorite one is about a globe of the world. And these lampshades, of course, went on lamps. And people tried to help her. She needed money, of course. And like Peggy Guggenheim tried to help Mina Loy and got her to make a lot of lampshades, which then she would sell. And her daughter, Joella, would come and help her sell the lampshades. And so someone is asking, how did my approach to Mina Loy change? Thank you for asking that. Enormously. When I started, I thought, oh, let's just write about her painting. I mean, I write about painters, right? And then I thought, well, wait a minute. She was kind of like also a poet. And then I wrote about, so that changed. I wanted to write about the ways in which the paintings and the poems changed each other. Of course, they do. And so you see in the Beinecke all the manuscripts, and I've done some changes, but you can see the ways in which her mind was getting more agile as herself was getting sometimes less agile. And she was likely to do herself in when she was getting old and ugly, or she thought she was ugly. I happen to think she was never ugly, but that's my point of view, not her point of view. And so her daughter had to sleep in the bed with her so she wouldn't do herself in. So when we talk, I was going to do a book on female suicides, and then I decided no, because I have a great friend who wrote a book called Stay Against Suicide. So I'm against it. I will read you to end with a love song. She's very famous for writing erotic poetry, Mina Loy. Very. Love song. This is the first, and then she changes it. Spawn of fantasies, sitting the appraisable pig Cupid, his rosy snout, rooting, I'm reading her in her writing, which is hard, rooting erotic garbage. Once upon a time, pulls a weed while star stopped among wild oats sown in numerous membranes. I would dash. This is her the first part. An eye and a Bengal light, eternity in a skyrocket, constellations in an ocean whose rivers run no fresher than a trickle of saliva. So you got the saliva and the pig snout, and I'll read you the end of it. There are certain places. I must live in my lantern, trumming subliminal flakes, flickers virginal to the bellows of experience, colored glass. Thank you. Mina Loy, 1915, very early. Thank you for having us.
Thank you so much to both of you. Thank you, Ann Caws and Grace Schulman, for being here tonight. That was a brilliant discussion on Mina Loy. It was so enlightening to hear about all the different facets of her life. And obviously it's such a treat to hear her poems read aloud as well. So thank you so much. A recording of this event will be posted immediately afterwards. So if you missed the beginning or the end, or if you'd like to share the event with a friend, the event will be archived right here on this page. All of our previous events are available to watch on the PCG Studio page as well. If you'd like to reserve Ann Caws's book, send us an email at info@192books.com. Our store is also open for browsing from 11 to 7 every day, or if you can't make it in person, you can order from our bookshop.org page for direct shipment. You can also sign up for our email newsletter in case you're curious about upcoming events. Our next event is Wednesday, July 6th. We will have Pepe Carmel and Lynn Gumpert discussing Bert Vey's Pow Right in the Eye, 30 years behind the scenes of modern French painting. So we really hope to see you there. And